Chapter 9, Social Stratification. In the US, what are the odds of a person being born into poverty? This varies based on whether you're born to a single mother, a married couple, and your race and ethnicity. So when we talk about social stratification, what do we mean? Every single society is marked by inequality, and the degree to which a society is marked by inequality really varies. And social stratification is the system by which a society ranks categories of people in a hierarchy. And so here in the US, we say we're a classless society, but we really aren't. And there's 4 basic principles involved here. So first of all, social stratification is a trait of society. It's not simply a reflection of individual differences. It persists over generations. We get our social position from our parents, and there is some social mobility, but people generally move horizontally. Social stratification is universal, but it varies, and it involves not just inequality, but beliefs, and those beliefs give some people more advantage and defines this as fair. So let's talk about caste and class systems. And closed systems allow little change in social position. So if you think about like a caste system, there's really no ability to move from one position to another, whereas open systems do have some mobility. So a caste system is based generally on birth or ascription, and it's closed, and birth alone determines your destiny. Determines who you're going to marry, determines the type of work you can do, shapes your belief, and it guides life by keeping people with their quote-unquote own kind. There's also status consistency here. So you're the same class across various measures, whether that be by measuring wealth, power, or prestige. Now, a class system develops out of modern economy, and that depends on developing the talents that individual people have. And so this is based a little bit in birth, but also in our individual achievement, and therefore is more open. The fact that people can move from one class to another blurs those distinctions between classes, and relatives may have different standing. Now, a meritocracy is social stratification based on merit. And to advance in a meritocracy, societies expand quality of opportunity. That differs from outcome equality. And it also means there's varying status consistency. So you may be higher class in terms of your wealth, but not higher class in terms of your prestige of your occupation, or vice versa. Now, all societies have classes, even those who claim not to, like our society here in the U.S. Now, in the former Soviet Union, the elite class was not based on wealth, but rather power. So there were the apparatchiks, which were the high government officials, the intelligentsia, which was lower government officials, professors, scientists, engineers, physicians. Then there were manual workers and rural peasants. So the Soviet Union was not classless at all. Putting factories, farms, colleges, and hospitals under state control created more economic equality than we have in capitalist societies. So the Russian Federation underwent what's called perestroika, or restructuring. And here we see some shifts in social positions of large numbers of people due to changes in society, as opposed to individual efforts. And despite recent economic improvement since the days of communism, Russians continue to face hard times. Now, China has a communist revolution in 1949. And after that, Mao Zedong says all types of work are equally important. And Deng Xiaoping says there's a new class of business owners. Whereas Xi Jinping says there's a small group of wealthy elites. So growing economic power is creating a new class system in China. And this also means then that economic inequality has increased. So let's look at some economic inequality in different countries, right? So driving to work in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Fabio Campos passes both gated mansions of the very rich and rundown shacks of the very poor. On her way to work in Stockholm, Sweden, Fraser Madsen passes through mostly middle-class neighborhoods. Okay, so a lot more equality in Sweden, in Norway, in the Scandinavian countries, right? Notice the US ranks pretty high on inequality. So, given how extensive social inequality is, how do societies persist without sharing resources in a more equal fashion? Well, this endures because of ideology. So, we come up with cultural beliefs that justify our particular arrangements, and that includes patterns of inequality. So, if you think back to slavery, right, or how we treated native populations here in the US, how colonials treated them, they developed these whole belief systems that justify their behavior. Now, every culture considers some type of inequality fair, but that ideology that gets used changes based on technology and the economy. Challenges to the status quo arise, though it's very hard to change social stratification. So, what function does social stratification serve? It plays a vital role in the operation of society. The Davis-Moore thesis says social stratification has beneficial consequences for the operation of a society. So, for example, the greater importance we lend to a particular position, the more rewards society gives it, in theory. So, this should promote hard work, productivity, efficiency. Any society can be egalitarian, but only to the extent that they're willing to let any person perform any job. But we have to think about whether or not we really reward jobs and positions based on how important they are, right? So let's think about school teachers. During COVID, the early days of the pandemic, once everybody was home, a lot of parents were like, whoa, teachers do a lot. And we started to see this massive appreciation for teachers, which kind of went away. But we don't pay teachers based on the work that they do. Think about those early grade school years where you're learning the skills that actually matter for the rest of your life. Reading, writing, math, things you need to do to function in society. Now, that's not to say that the learning we're doing here is not important, but honestly, if you don't understand this chapter, you'll be fine. Okay? You'll be able to get a job, you'll be able to take care of your family, everything will be okay. Right? But are we really rewarding people commensurate with their contribution? Then think about professional athletes, people who are obviously extremely talented and have dedicated their life to a physical pursuit. But is their physical pursuit worth millions and tens of $millions a year? So one thing to think about is, do our rewards really reflect the contribution one makes? Caste systems, on the flip side, right, they prevent the development of talents. So if you're locked into a particular position because of the family you were born into, maybe you're actually the person that's going to come up with the cure for cancer, but you can't go to medical school. Social inequality also promotes conflict and revolution. Social stratification provides some people with advantages over others, right? So this is looking at things from that conflict perspective. So Marx talked extensively about conflict, right? Marx is what communism is based in. So they were looking for a revolution, right? So Marxists believe that capitalism is bad and that the workers should throw a revolution and basically overthrow capitalism, okay? The Industrial Revolution is supposed to promise us a society where we don't want for anything. But capitalism hasn't really improved the lives of most people. How can we in a society so rich have so many people who are so poor, whose basic needs are not met? So social stratification is rooted in our relationship to the means of production. So nobility, like kings and queens, right, and royal families, got replaced by capitalists, which Marx refers to as the bourgeoisie, which is where your term bougie comes from. And serfs became proletarians. And so their opposing interest here makes class conflict inevitable. Marx believed capitalism would bring its own downfall. And it really doesn't, and it doesn't for a couple reasons, which we'll talk about in the next slide. This idea is considered pretty controversial. It ignores the idea that the Davis-Moore thesis puts out, that unequal rewards motivate people, and we haven't had any revolutionary change. But there's reasons for that, okay? So one is the capitalist class is fragmented, right? So giant companies that are worth a lot of money are often owned by stockholders, right? More people have a direct stake in the capitalist system. If you're paying into a 401k at work, a retirement plan, that's probably wrapped up in stocks. Okay. There's also a higher standard of living today. Most workers are far better off. Okay. That is because of more legal protections. So while what Marx wanted to come true didn't come true, some things Marx was advocating for did happen, right? So we have like OSHA guidelines. There's safety guidelines at jobs. There's guidelines about what age you can work at, what kind of jobs you can do, how many hours you can work, right? You have to be paid for your work or be in an internship where you're getting college credit, right? So we also have things like unemployment, Social Security, and disability pay. There's also more worker organizations, right? So we have unions, and that's able to settle those threats or issues or concerns without threatening the system. Despite this, though, wealth is still highly concentrated. 40% of all property belongs to the 1% of the population. Many white-collar jobs hold no more income than blue-collar jobs. In fact, there's a lot of blue-collar jobs that you can do that will pay significantly more. My brother's an electrician. He did not go to college. He has no student loan debt, and he makes significantly more money than I do. And the rich use the legal system better than the poor do. Part of that is because they can afford attorneys. So Weber says that social stratification results from how three types of inequality interconnect. Okay, one is economic inequality, status, and power. So when we think about SES, socioeconomic status, right, prestige and power are reflections of our economic position, and status consistency in modern societies is quite low. So when we talk about socioeconomic status or class here in the United States, it's based on several things, right? You could be considered middle class or upper class and not maybe necessarily have the income that goes with that, but you might have a job or status or power that gives you prestige. Now, throughout history, inequality looks a little different based on the type of society. So in agrarian societies, farming societies, status or social prestige is the main difference, and it takes the form of honor. During industrialization, it takes the form of money. And as we have bigger government and the growth of state, power is the key difference. So let's think about how technology plays a role here. When we have simple technology, right? We've got the plow, simple farming technology, for example. Our survival depends on sharing. And no category of people is better off. In a horticultural society, there's small elites that control the surplus of goods. This puts the nobility in a godlike position. And during industrialization, we start nudging inequality downward, and we sort of uphold this idea of a meritocracy, that people get ahead based on merit, that they earn that position. Now let's think about our third perspective here, symbolic interaction. This is a micro-level analysis. Our social standing affects our everyday interactions. People interact primarily with people that are on like a similar social level of us. One way we see this kind of play out is in what's called conspicuous consumption, right? So sometimes this is like visually signaling what things you can afford and what message that sends, right? So do you have a MacBook or do you have a Chromebook? Do you have no computer? Do you have an iPhone? Which iPhone do you have? Do you have an Apple Watch, right? Do you have fancy jewelry? What's the brand of your jewelry, right? Can I recognize the brand of your jewelry? And so conspicuous consumption is buying and using products because of the statement they make about social position. And so while you may have chosen Apple products for a reason, right? So I am talking to you with an iPhone on my lap and a MacBook in front of me, and behind me is an iPad, and on my wrist is a Apple Watch. And those are all things that I like the quality of these products. So a MacBook is significantly more expensive than other laptops, but they last significantly longer, and Apple has superior customer service. And so to me, it's worth spending that extra money. But it also does send a signal, right? You know that I can afford a MacBook. I can't afford much else, but. So micro level analysis, this symbolic interaction level, helps us see how this creates different patterns in the lives of people. It doesn't have much to say, though, about how and why broad patterns exist. So let's delve into that technology and stratification a little bit more. We just kind of talked about this. So as a reminder, hunting and gathering societies have simple technology. Members produce only what's necessary for day-to-day living, and no categories of people or classes are better off than others. As we move into horticultural, pastoral, and agrarian societies, we start to have surpluses, right? So if I'm farming, I probably have more things than I actually need. And so that creates social inequality. A small elite group controls that surplus, and large-scale agriculture is much more productive. In industrial societies, inequality is pushed downward and meritocracy takes hold. That weakens the power of an aristocracy. It raises the standard of living. Specialized work means people go to school, right? And a lot of people go to school, right? Why are you here? Why have you chosen the major you're choosing? Despite the fact that you're getting a college education and you're going to take gen ed requirements and you're going to get a well-rounded education, you're going to specialize in a field. You're going to take most of your coursework in your major, presumably preparing you for some specific type of job you would like. Now, Kuznets' curve says the greater inequality is functional for agrarian societies, but industrial societies benefit from a more equal system. Here we can see income inequality globally, right? So here we have in Santiago, Rogelio Rodriguez is a university student in a city marked by dramatic differences between rich and poor. In Sweden, someone is a university student where economic differences are small by global standards. Now notice the US, right? We have pretty severe inequality. That's probably not news to any of you. So let's look at inequality in the US. With the exception of a racial history, we have not had a rigid caste system that ranks people, but we do have a highly stratified society though. So we tend to think of the United States as a middle-class society, but is it really a middle-class society? So let's talk about these components then of socioeconomic status, right? So one is income, and income is a component of wealth. Okay, income is literally money you make. You can be a rich person and have no income because you don't have a job, okay, or you don't have investments. U.S. society is highly stratified, and so income inequality has been increasing. And the very richest people now receive a much larger share of income. Wealth includes more than just your income. It's the total value of money and other assets you have minus debts. This is distributed even more unequally, right? So the richest 20% of U.S. families own close to 90% of the country's wealth, right? Wealth is generational and it gets passed down. Data for 2019 suggests the median wealth for U.S. families is about $125,000. Now, the lowest ranking 40% of U.S. families have little to no wealth. Now, work is another source of prestige, right? So sociologists measure the relative prestige of various occupations. So things like being a doctor or a lawyer, right, have higher prestige than being a waitress or a janitor. If you think about like jobs that we kind of look down our nose at, right? So high prestige occupations tend to go to privileged categories of people. Now, some of those high prestige in occupations require you to have a certain level of schooling and maybe even a certain type of schooling from a certain school, right? So professor is a job that has a lot of occupational prestige, but not a lot of income or wealth. Now, income and wealth shape our schooling options, right? Like maybe you have everything it takes to go to Harvard, right? But you can't afford it, right? Even with the financial aid you get. Even a lot of people who go to less prestigious colleges than Harvard, right? Sometimes school is not an option. Sometimes school is just way too expensive. But schooling affects our occupations and our income. There's some jobs you literally can't get without a college degree, right? And then there's some jobs you can't get out with a graduate degree. Most blue collar jobs do not require advanced schooling. They might require like trade schooling. And people who attend college typically come from families with above average income and wealth. Now, note, that doesn't mean that you're rich. It means above average. So you'd have to look at what the average wealth or income is and compare that. Now, what else impacts this? Ancestry has a strong effect on schooling, occupation, and income. So half of the country's richest people get their wealth from family, and poverty gets inherited too. 74% of white families own their own home compared to 48% of black families. Okay, a larger portion of single families are black. People of English ancestry have the most wealth and power, and female single-headed parent households are 6 times more likely to be poor than those headed by a man. So our class system is more fluid and defining class is less easy. Marx basically talked about 2 classes, capitalists and the proletariat. And Weber talked about different dimensions of a status hierarchy. But here in the US, we have a relatively low level of status consistency. So like, as I mentioned, right, being a professor is a job that, like when I tell people I'm a professor, people are like, ooh, right? They also assume I make a crap ton of money, which I do not. And so while it may be a prestigious job, a job that people consider like, fancy, it's not a job that pays a lot. Okay. Social mobility does allow for change in social position throughout our lifetime. So when we break down the US classes, where they're generally broken down into upper class, middle class, working class, and lower class. Guess what, guys? Most of us are middle class. Okay. Upper class is about 5% of the U.S. population, earning at least $164,000 a year. Many have inherited wealth, and historically, they are WASPs. If you are unfamiliar with the term WASP, it does not mean the bee-like creature. It's white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. Now, 1% of the population is like the upper class. They're often referred to as blue bloods. This membership here is almost always on birth. This is referred to as old money, and they look down their nose at new money. They go to private schools, they study liberal arts, they volunteer. The other 3 to 4%, the lower upper class, these are the working rich, and they have earned as opposed to inherited their wealth. Now, a big chunk of the U.S. population is middle class, right? But it's not all of us. It's 40 to 45%. And this has a tremendous influence on our culture. This is where our popular culture comes from. And TV and movies are usually depicting this lifestyle. Most commercials are reflected at this group, and there's a lot more ethnic and racial diversity. So upper middle class is $164,000 to $306,000 per year. They can accumulate property. About 2/3 of them are college grads, and many have gone on to grad school. High prestige jobs. They might play roles in political affairs at the local level. This is not college professors. Average middle class, less prestigious white collar jobs, highly skilled blue collar jobs. $67,000 to $164,000 a year. Small amount of wealth. They might have a house and a retirement package. They have likely gone to state school, and maybe half of them have completed college. Now, the working class is also sometimes called lower middle class. These are a lot of blue collar jobs, $38,000 to $67,000 per year, little or no wealth, very vulnerable to financial problems if somebody gets ill or somebody can't work. Many of their jobs do not provide personal satisfaction, right? So that's another thing. I would bet a lot of you guys as college students are working jobs that like you work to pay your bills, right? And to have money. It's not a job that you consider a calling or that you find personal fulfillment in. About half own their own home, and about 1/5 of their children go to college. Now, the lower class is about 11% of the U.S. population. It's about 37 million people. 3/4 of them complete high school, and about 15% complete a 4-year college degree. 1/3 own their own homes, but many are in less desirable urban and rural neighborhoods. Others are quote unquote working poor, making minimum wage jobs. So what difference does our class make? Well, first of all, it impacts our health. Children born into poor families are 3 times more likely to die from disease, neglect, accidents, or violence during their first year of life. Richer people live 7 years longer because they eat more nutritious food, live in safer and less stressful environments, and receive better medical care. I don't know if you guys are at the point in your life where you've done your own grocery shopping at all, but if you haven't, this is an interesting thing to think about, right? If you were to go into the grocery store and you wanted to buy all fresh, healthy foods, you want to buy fruit and vegetables, maybe you care if they're organic, right? You don't want to buy a lot of stuff that's got preservatives as frozen. Well, that stuff's expensive. What's cheap? Those dollar, 99-cent Mama Celeste pizzas that have like 3 pieces of cheese on them, a little bit of sauce, and you pop them in the microwave, right? One thing is going to be more nutritious than the other. Shopping at Whole Foods is much more expensive than shopping at Market Basket. Cultural values are based in our class as well. So upper class talk about understated manners and taste, right? The new rich engage in a lot of conspicuous consumption. Affluent people with greater education are often more tolerant of controversial behavior, whereas the working class tends to be less tolerant. Privileged people tend to be Republican. The richer you are, the more conservative you often are politically, and working class tend to be Democrats. Those are tendencies, guys, not hard and fast rules. Family and the social class we're in also plays a role in how gender plays out for us. So lower class families are somewhat larger. They often get married younger and have less use of birth control. Parents in higher class often teach kids to express individuality and imagination more freely. Working class couples divide responsibilities, often along gender roles. Men take out the trash, women do the dishes. Middle class couples tend to share more responsibilities. Working class friendships are more about how can people help each other out, whereas middle class friendships are more about pursuing shared interests. Maybe you play pickleball together. Now, long-term social mobility is due to changes in society. So you can have intra-generational social mobility, intra meaning within your own lifetime, and inter, children in relation to parents. So for many generations, each generation that came along did better than their parents' generation. My generation is the first generation to not necessarily do that. That is not because my generation is like lazy in some way. It's absolutely due to culture, society, and the economy. So while we preach here in the United States, work hard, you can get whatever you want. That's probably part of your reason for being here in college. There might not be as much social mobility as we think there is. So there's a lot of horizontal social mobility. People change careers, they change fields that they work in. That's super common. Now, over the last prior century, right, there was very high social mobility, and the long-term trend has been upward. But within one single generation, it's pretty small. And since the 70s, it's been uneven. That's when my generation started being born. Okay, so in terms of mobility, white people have been more upwardly mobile in recent decades. Women have had less opportunities for upward mobility. They tend to hold jobs that don't pay as well, offer fewer promotions. When women leave work temporarily to raise children and they come back, they're often behind where their male counterparts were. When marriages end in divorce, it usually doesn't impact men in terms of their status or their income or their social class, but women experience downward mobility. Now, the earning gaps between men and women has been narrowing, but it still exists. Marriage can push your social standing upward. There are financial benefits to marriage. The wealth benefit of marriage can also result from the culture of marriage. And we know that divorce results in a decline in social position. So obviously, if 2 people are married, right, they've combined their incomes, they're living in the same house, they're not paying 2 rents, 2 mortgages, right? They're not paying 2 sets of electric bills. So just even practically, like you're sharing expenses, and that obviously helps. So as we talked about before, right, we have this concept called the American dream here, right? And this is this idea of socially upward mobility. And historically, we've fulfilled this by raising living standards. But for many workers, earnings have stalled. Many people hold multiple jobs. More jobs offer little income. And young people are remaining at home longer. Now, underlying changes here in the US is, of course, global changes as well, not just changes in our culture. Many industries that gave workers high-paying jobs, right? So you used to be able to get a good high-paying job out of high school that required skill, right? Cars were manufactured here in the United States. You could go work in a factory and you could get a good job and you could have a pension and you could retire. A lot of those jobs have moved overseas. So this global economy is driving upward mobility for people like lawyers, people in finance, marketing, computer technology. But for others, it means that highly skilled jobs have gone overseas, where we can pay people less money to perform those same jobs. They've also been replaced with a lot of jobs that are more service oriented. I don't mean by that like waiters and waitresses. If you think about, again, the job of being a professor, right? I don't produce a product. I don't manufacture a product, right? I am paid for sharing my knowledge and helping you understand that knowledge. And that just doesn't pay as well as a technical skill. So let's think about poverty in the US, right? So there's absolute poverty, right? Deprivation of resources that's life-threatening. Do you have enough food to eat? Okay? Do you have a safe place to sleep? Things like that. And then there's relative poverty, how poor you are compared to other people, right? So the US, being poor in the US is better than being poor in India, right? But being poor in the US still sucks. So in 2020, about 37 million men, women, and children were classified as poor. One thing to know about classification as being poor in the United States, we have what's called a poverty line. That is what it costs to feed a family of four times 3. That's where we draw the poverty line. The poverty line is very low. Many of us would consider people who live above the poverty line to also be poor. Okay? So in 2020, the poverty line is $26,000. So what do the poor look like? About 16% of people under 18 are poor. 14% of people ages 18 to 24 are poor. About 13% are elderly. 2/3 of all poor people are white. 2/3 of all people are white. Well, all people in the United States. Okay. In 2020, almost 20% of black people and 17% of Hispanic people live in poverty. That's disproportionate. Okay. So people of color have high rates of child poverty. In terms of family patterns, 56% of poor people are women. Women who are heads of household are at a high risk for poverty. So poverty has been feminized in a way. This is the trend of women making up an increasing proportion of the poor, right? So a lot of times when parents split, or if parents have never been married, right, and now it's a single mom taking care of kids, many of you guys may have grown up in a family like this. That doesn't mean the dad is providing any income or support, or the dad might be providing minimum income and support. This is not a dig at your dads. You might have a dad that's a good dude who totally came through, right? But a lot of dads don't contribute. And that means it's all on that mom to do that all by herself. Now, the greatest concentration of poverty is found in central cities, but most of the counties with the highest poverty rate in the U.S. are rural. So what causes poverty? Some people will tell you poor people are just lazy, okay? Poor people are responsible for their own poverty. We value self-reliance in this country, right? The American dream says you can do it. So this leads to the belief that social standing is a matter of individual talent and effort, and that the poor become trapped in a culture of poverty. Basically, it destroys their ambition. You've probably heard people say things like, oh, people are on welfare and they just want to be on welfare because they don't have to work for that money. You don't get a lot of money on welfare, guys. The second approach is that society is responsible for poverty, right? So we have these jobs. There used to be jobs in factories in the city, and it was easy for people to get to those jobs. If those jobs have moved overseas, they're not available. If they've moved out into the suburbs, how do people without cars get there if there's no public transportation? There's not enough work to support families, and it results in little opportunity. So in 2020, about 10% of heads of poor families worked at least 50 weeks a year. Okay, so that's full-time work, right? Like 52 weeks in a year, assume 2 weeks for vacation. Individual ability and personal effort do play a part in shaping our social position, but society is the primary cause of poverty. There's so many jobs that offer only low wages, and not because those companies can only afford to pay that, right? So Amazon, if you work for Amazon, it pays relatively well, right? But compared to the profits they're making, they can absolutely pay their drivers and the people that work in their factories and their warehouses significantly more money. On any given night, about 500,000 people are homeless, and in a year, that's about 1.5 million people. The new homeless are people thrown out of work because of plant closings, forced out of apartments due to rent increases and low wages, right? We live in Massachusetts. Depending on the measure you use, this is the most, or I think Boston might be the second most expensive city to live in the country. 44% of homeless work at least part-time. A third are substance abusers. A quarter are mentally ill, right? So obviously bigger forces play a role in this. And children are the fastest growing category of homeless. Economic inequality has been increasing since 1980. So the highest 1% today receives about 22% of all income. Is that because they're better, smarter, and work harder than the rest of us do? Probably not. Right? Some of the people that work the hardest are being paid the least, and we also value those jobs very little. Now, the core values of competitive individualism and personal responsibility support the idea that we should have unequal rewards. Well, maybe the very rich are just worth the money. People doubt that the highest paid individuals are really worth the money they're paid. Defenders of such high pay claim that companies pay whatever it takes to attract the most talented people to top leadership. What does this mean for the rest of us? Is it possible for us to get ahead? Income inequality raises doubt that people who are willing to work hard can get ahead. Fewer people believe that working hard is the key to getting ahead now. A lot of people work in jobs where like the raise is just based on whatever the board approves that year, a certain percentage, right? And it's got nothing to do with merit or what you've earned. Now, the pandemic plays a role in this too, right? So this brought public attention to some disparities in health between classes, right? So health costs were greater amongst lower social classes. If you don't have health insurance and you're sick, what do you do and where do you go? If you've lost your job because of the pandemic, you might not have insurance. And how are you going to take care of yourself? So research found that the lower class position someone held, the less able they were to fend off COVID-19. Think about the people who had to continue working. Some of you guys might have had jobs where you continued working. One thing that really struck me was people who work in grocery stores. Now, of course, we need grocery stores to be open. But so many people who work in grocery stores are teenagers, right? So we're in the middle of a pandemic. We don't know what causes it. And we're like, you know who should still have to go to work? Teenagers, children, okay? Well-off people generally have better health. You might have heard about how some people went to their second home, their summer home, to quarantine. So here we can see some distribution of, poverty, right? So notice percentage of people below the poverty line in Massachusetts, and we have poor people here, right? Mass and Cass is not that far away from campus. But we have a relatively low percentage of people living below the poverty line. I mean, you kind of can't live in Massachusetts if you don't have a higher income. Okay, so what we think about poverty and wealth depends not just on facts, but our politics as well. And the idea that social standing reflects merit is popular amongst people who are well off. They like to think they earned that position, right? You might hear a lot of people balk at the idea of white privilege, right? Because they hear the word privilege and they often think like, oh, what does it mean to be privileged? I'm not wealthy, right? People like to think they've earned their privilege. But the idea that society should spread wealth more equally is popular amongst people who are working. Our culture explains why we spend so much on education, because it promotes opportunity, and less on public assistance, which directly supports the poor.